Ago.
If I would bring
Okay, so I did mine on Transcendentalism, which I'm guessing none of you have ever heard of, ever. No. Because I hadn't either. So, okay, I can go to the next. Before I start talking about the authors that I did, I'm just thought I'd try to explain to you what Transcendentalism is. It was a philosophical, religious, and literary movement that it was in the middle of the 19th century, which is like 1836 to 1860. It began as a religious movement against the Rationalist Institute Unitarianism had become. Because Unitarianism was a religion, and a couple of the people I'm going to talk about were actually like involved in a Unitarian church, but things started to change and it was kind of conservative, and they didn't like that, so they were rebelling against the Unitarianism church. So my first person is Ralph Waldo Emerson. He was an author and like a poet, not really a poet, but he talked to people about stuff. His first book that he published was Nature, which received little notice at the time, but now it's like one of his most famous pieces of work. He started out as a Unitarian minister, like I said before, but he left that industry to travel abroad as a public speaker and writer. He did a lot of speeches at Harvard, which is where he went to school. He was also a member of the Transcendentalist Club. All the people I'm going to talk about were a member of this club. It was basically, they all came together to talk about what they thought they should do about the problems that they're having with the church and stuff. He became more popular after publication of essays, which was one of his other things that he wrote. And later, 3 years after that, he came out with Essays, the second part. So he also wrote a couple other things, The American Scholar and the Divinity School Address. These lectures were delivered at Harvard, and some people thought that they were inappropriate because he spoke strongly about criticism of traditional religious education, since basically what they were against was religion. So some people didn't like that, so they opposed what he was speaking about. You go to the next one. And up there are just a couple of his famous things. You go to the next one. And the next person in was Henry David Thoreau. He's had many famous pieces of work. Perhaps his most famous, though, was Resistance to Civil War, which is also known as civil disobedience. You also need to know that. So, all right. This essay demonstrated the value Thoreau put on nature and the individual. That was the Civil War thing. He first published work was A Week in the Concord and Merrimack Rivers, which was published in 1849. It was a tribute to his brother, because his brother died a couple years before he wrote that, and he had gone on a canoe trip with his brother, and then he wrote about that like as a memory about him. Yeah. And equally as popular as Civil Disobedience was Walden, which is another thing that he wrote. He started writing it in 1846. It contained information about his life during the 2 years he lived at the Walden Pond, and it was published in 1854. He lived on actually Ralph Waldo Emerson's, that was his property that he lived on when he was doing this, and he just lived there for a long time. He did gardening and stuff, and he just wrote about what all he did. Go to the next one. The next person did was Margaret Fuller. She was also a member of the Transcendentalist Club. She was a feminist, a social reformer, and an author who contributed greatly to the American Renaissance. She was a teacher as well and traveled from place to place. She taught off and on for a long time. If someone gave her a teaching job, she'd go do that, but she wrote in between there and did lots of other stuff. She held classes where women could use their knowledge and discuss what they knew about subjects like ethics and women's rights, because back then women didn't have a whole lot of rights, so men were more highly regarded, so she gave women a chance to share what they knew, so they felt more important. In 1838, at the invitation of Ralph Waldo Emerson, she began attending the Transcendentalism Club meetings. Here, she agreed to be the editor of the Transcendentalist Journal, which was called The Dial. In July 1843, she published her essay, The Great Lawsuit, Man vs. Man and Women vs. Women. After this, she took a tour of the Great Lakes, which was the setting of her next work, which was called Summer on the Lakes in 1843. In 1845, she published Women in the 19th Century, which exposed Fuller's knowledge of literature and philosophy by explaining oppression of females in history and equal status of women. She was really representative of women's rights, and that was one of her main focuses. Okay, you go to the next one. There wasn't a whole lot of art directly related to Transcendentalism, but many of the painters in this time period looked towards nature for stuff. So a lot of the paintings that were done during this time were stuff from outside because they thought that nature was God's, I don't know what the word would be, it was a representation of God's power and beauty, so they thought that nature was really important. And Transcendentalist painters captured the romance and such of the American landscape in their paintings, similar to how Emerson and Thoreau did in their writing. So, yeah, next slide. So here's just a couple examples of stuff that they painted back then. The first one's by Albert Bierstein. It's called Echo Lakes. A lot of the stuff was just scenic stuff like that. And the other one's called The Voyage of Life by Thomas Cole. That's more excited, but I couldn't find anything about music during this time period. There wasn't anything related to music and Transcendentalism because it's more religious. It wasn't anything to do with that, but I did find that the music during this time period was classical stuff with lots of emotion, and the composers during this time period were Beethoven, Brahms, Schumann, and Schubert. They wrote music during this time period a lot. That's all. We'll actually have a conclusion. But to sum up Transcendentalism, it was mostly a group of Boston ministers who decided that the Unitarian Church was too conservative, so they wanted to change the philosophy to something more open to human soul and individualism. It also deals with thought and nature. Are there any questions? Yeah.
What kind of ministers?
Boston, they're from Boston.
Oh.
Yeah, she'll turn that off.
I got it. We read
And
it.
some stuff you guys might want to know for the quiz, what time period did